Welcome. Thank you. Today's webinar is going to be about Introduction to Labor Market Information, or LMI. It is hosted by your Regional Center of Excellence for Labor Market Research. We serve the San Diego and Imperial region, so hopefully you're in the right room. But we're going to walk you through what is expected of today, who we are, and the basics of LMI. And then I will walk you through what to expect for the rest of the week, as well as some of those reflection sessions that you signed up for. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat when we enable the chat. It's not going to be enabled during the webinar portion of this, but we will allocate time for Q&A. So please reserve your questions until the chat is enabled, and I'll cue you when to ask your questions. All right, let's get started. So who are we and what do we do? So as I mentioned, we're the Regional Center of Excellence for Labor Market Research. And if you're not familiar with labor market research, the way I like to describe it is it's simply market research, but on jobs and employment in a particular region. Typically, when we talk about labor market research, we look at demand and supply. So what is the supply of workers for any given demand from employers and occupations? So that's what we do as a Center of Excellence. We try to produce reports and products that will help the region's community colleges and other stakeholders make decisions when it comes to the labor market. So if you're not familiar with the COE, or the Centers of Excellence, we are located across the whole state of California. There are about 10 centers across the state of California. We are primarily funded by the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office, which is why if you've ever seen any of our reports, they're primarily focused on the community college framework or point of view. And in our region, we report to the San Diego and Imperial Regional Consortium. So there's a regional consortium of all of the San Diego and Imperial community colleges, and there are about 10 of them in our region, which are listed here. So our center and our team mostly helps with reports for career technical education, but a lot of other departments might end up using our reports as well. So that's the gist of what we do. With me, you'll see our team, and we're the Regional COE team, or the Center of Excellence for Labor Market Research team. My name is Bartel, and I'm the director of our center. Joining me is John Edwards, our research analyst, Priscilla Fernandez, also our research analyst, and Robert Chu, who helps us with admin and project management. The other team that we have working on today's presentation, as well as the rest of this training, is from the Regional Consortium. So I mentioned earlier that we report both to the Chancellor's Office and the Regional Consortium. They're a body made up of representatives from various colleges, and there's a team specifically called the Regional Consortium team. And with us today, we have Heather Cavazos and Monica Rosas, as well as Christopher Yerkes, and they will provide us support for today's presentation, as well as some of the reflection questions that are coming up later this week. In the flyer, you may have noticed that we're partnering with some external partners. Our other team partner is Sarah Burns, and she'll be helping out with tomorrow's presentation on labor market resources and available tools. So she's the Director of Research Application at the San Diego Workforce Partnership, and you'll hear a little bit more about her and what resources that they have during tomorrow's presentation. Okay, so let's go through some housekeeping items and what to expect now that you know who the teams are who are helping facilitate this training, this LMI Labor Market Information training. So what can you expect during this training? Well, as indicated in the flyer, we are going to have 3 days of webinar instruction. Today's the first, and we're going to do an intro to LMI. Tomorrow, it will be followed by an overview of LMI tools and resources. So Sarah, as I mentioned, will walk you through all the variety of labor market information resources that are out there, or at least a snapshot of it, so you can understand what's available to you. And then on Wednesday, we'll go through how to apply some of those tools and resources to specific situations that come up in your line of work. Those are the webinars. Following the webinars will be what we call guided reflection sessions. And they will be held on Thursdays, May 6th, which is this week, May 27th, and June 17th. And again, a lot of these reflection sessions will look at how you can apply this LMI, the labor market information, to your work. The reflection sessions will have guided questions. So it'll guide you through how to answer certain questions that might come up and where you can find LMI to answer those questions. So we really highly recommend that you attend the reflection sessions if you can. Okay, so going back to this week. So for today, we're gonna go through the basics of LMI. We're gonna differentiate between demand and supply, as I mentioned before, in the labor market research and how that's calculated. Then we're gonna learn when to use traditional versus real-time labor market information. These are just terminologies that you'll get acquainted with by the end of the presentation, but essentially we just wanted you to know that these are the three main topics that we'll focus on today. Tomorrow, Sarah's going to, again, as I mentioned, provide an overview of available LMI tools and resources. She'll go through the pros and cons of those resources and then review some potential use cases. And on day 3, you'll have me back again, and we're going to explore those scenarios that require LMI and look specifically at the resources and tools that our team produced for our region, for San Diego and Imperial counties, and how those tools might be used to answer questions and problems that come up during those scenarios. So that was what you can expect for this week in terms of the webinars. Please keep in mind that you'll have the same Zoom link for the next couple of days. And on Thursday, the reflection session, you'll have a separate one depending whether you're an instructional faculty or a counseling faculty. So since you're all here, you should have that Zoom link right there and the password. This is the same one again for today, tomorrow, and on Wednesday. For the reflection sessions, again, the first one being May 6th, you'll have a different Zoom link and you'll get different calendar appointments for those reflection sessions. If you have any difficulty accessing those Zoom links, please contact Monica Rosas or Robert Chu. They will be emailing you throughout this time, and so feel free to contact them directly if you have any issues with the Zoom. All right, we're almost done with housekeeping. Final thing, please keep yourselves muted. Save your questions until later. Monica will enable the chat when it's time for us to ask questions. So feel free to type them into the chat. We'll be able to have a time reserved for your Q&A during that time, and I'll cue you for it. We will definitely send out the PowerPoint slides later, as well as post them on our website. So that way you have a chance to access every information that you see today. Great. All right, that was housekeeping items. Now we can actually get into the meat and potatoes of labor market information. So why is LMI important? We typically use LMI to examine careers and programs that will help our students and job seekers with social mobility. So as you know, during the pandemic, it's been a pretty rough time. What's even worse is that the cost of living continues to rise in San Diego County. So we want to make sure that we use labor market information to look at careers and opportunities that will help our students become more resilient despite the very strenuous economy that they have to face. So just to give you some context on why LMI is important, when we look at this, we see housing prices in San Diego County increasing dramatically after the Great Recession, right? So even between 2019 and 2020, the housing prices for a median home single family detached home went from $644,000 last year, or 2019, to $701,000 in 2020. This was an annual average. And we took this graph from Sandag. They just did a report analyzing the impact of COVID. And they found that while there are discrepancies in people being able to be resilient during the recession, housing prices have been increasing dramatically because there's so much demand for it. So it's very difficult, as you can see here, to live and afford a home in San Diego County. That's why we look at labor market information to identify occupations that pay at least a living wage and have opportunities for mobility, so our students and our job seekers can be able to at least survive in our region. So that's why LMI is important, one of the ways that we look at it. So what is labor market information? I'm going to start off by sharing with you what traditional labor market information is, and then I'll walk you through what real-time labor market information is. So these are just some terms to just differentiate the different types of data that we look at. One is a little bit more in the past, and real time is based on real-time data that we can get, but it's not as reliable as past or historical data. So let's look at traditional LMI. So what is it? Traditional LMI is typically what is reported to a government agency in terms of employment or workforce data. So we'll see demand and supply data. We'll look at wages in traditional LMI, entry-level wages, median experience wages, and educational attainment. These are just some of the data sets that are available with traditional labor market information. It's a snapshot in time, and traditional labor market information gives us a historical view of what's happened so far. And it's pretty reliable because it's reported data, it's been cleaned, and so we can look at it to make some projections. The issue with traditional labor market information, however, is that it doesn't capture disruptions in the market. So if something new recently happened in legislation, a pandemic hits out of the blue, a lot of the traditional LMI data might be a little bit might be off because it doesn't, again, capture recent events or current events. So keep that in mind in terms of the challenges with traditional labor market information. So where does our traditional LMI come from? Typically, whenever you look at any labor market research report, the data comes from either state or federal sources. Every single state has a labor market information division or a statistical agency that reports employment and wage data to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In the state of California, we have the Employment Development Department. You probably recognize them as the folks that send out the unemployment insurance information or the unemployment rates data all across the state. But they have a labor market information division that collects data from employers and workers, and they report it to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then every single state's data gets aggregated by BLS or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that's where you get a lot of your reports and articles on employment and wages across the whole nation. Just to give you a visual, this is how it really looks. So on the demand side, employer demand, or what employers are looking for in the workforce, EDD, or an equivalent labor market information division, or again, statistical agency, will survey employers and workers. Oops, there we go. They take those responses from employers and workers, EDD takes that, and then they report it to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we get data on employers and workers in that kind of pathway. For the supply side, or supply data of LMI, it comes from educational institutions. So again, my constituents represent the California community colleges, and we report the community college data directly to the Chancellor's office at the state level through a system called the MIS Data Mart. Chancellor's office, or the state that oversees that data from the community colleges, takes that information and puts it into various databases like visualizations like CalPlus Plus Launchboard. These are different tools that the state of California uses in order to identify what's going on in the supply side, what students are doing, and how many people we're pumping out of the community college system. Non-California community colleges report their data in a different way. They actually go through the National Clearinghouse, and they report it through something called IPEDS. So all of that data is supply data, again, information on students, and demand data is information on employment and what employers are looking for in the labor market, what jobs they have in demand, essentially. So to quantify it, we measure demand and supply by looking at two different things. So demand, again, is employer demand, and we can look at demand by identifying the number of average annual job openings that a particular job has. And for supply, we look at the average number of degrees and certificates that are awarded that is related to the occupations that are in demand. So we're going to go into detail about what demand and supply are and exactly how to calculate these. But I'm going to pause there for now, and ask for anybody to have any clarifying questions so far to type your questions in the chat. So give Monica a minute to enable the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to type it into the chat.
Ready.
Thanks, Monica. So Catelyn asks, do jobs in the gig economy are figured into demand? So jobs in the gig economy are not into the demand figures. That's what is going to be reflected in what we call real-time LMI, or real-time labor market information. And I'll get into that a little bit about what real-time labor market information is. For those of you who are not aware of what the gig economy is, it's basically a term for individuals that have gigs, essentially. They have a job that has a very defined begin and end time and date. It's a project. So think of gig workers like, I have a delivery I need to make. I'll pick up the order, deliver it, and that gig is done. The term was taken from the music industry based on how musicians would take gigs, those one-off projects or one-time gigs, perform, and then they'd be done with it. So the gig economy really reflects those short-term 1099 sole proprietor, independent contractor type of jobs. And on the demand side, jobs are tracked for both full-time and part-time jobs. So those are usually included on in the survey questions whenever EDD or any other statistical agency surveys employers and workers. So yes, the demand side does track full-time and part-time data, full-time and part-time workers. Okay. So Brian asked about how do we get LMI data that's fixed, that's clearly wrong. I'm going to address that at the end of our presentation. I always want to inform people whenever we do these types of presentations on LMI, we want to emphasize that the data is not necessarily wrong, but it is it is limited. The reason why it's not wrong is because it's reported data. So if somebody inaccurately reported the data, the output is only as good as the input. So if employers are misleading the government in these survey responses or responding inaccurately to surveys, that would affect the output or what the results of the data sets look like. So again, I wouldn't say that the data is necessarily wrong, but there are limitations. And yes, we always try to address data quality issues. But these data have been collected for quite a while now. So we would like to think that traditional LMI is pretty reliable, but it's not the same as real-time LMI, which is where I think you're getting at, which I'll get to again. Okay. All right, so I'm going to pause there for some of the questions. I'll go through some of these more in detail later on in the presentation about how they clean the data and so forth, and reliability. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Again, all the labor market information that we have is reported information. It's reported directly by workers and employers whenever they get a survey. These surveys are done regularly. And so EDD and other statistical agencies have repeated the survey multiple times. So the reliability is there because of the frequency and how often they do the surveys. Same thing on the college side. We'll get to why some of the college data might be inaccurate. And again, it's based on the input. Whatever you report, that's what gets pumped out into the reports. So if an educational institution is reporting inaccurately, the resulting report will have inaccurate information. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but essentially it's input and output of how the data gets collected and then reported. Okay, so I thank you everybody for engaging and asking those questions. All right, so Monica, if you can disable the chat for now. Again, everybody, please save your questions as we continue on. All right, so we're talking about demand and supply data. So let's go to labor market demand data, and what is it? So earlier we talked about demand from employers, and then also supply from educational institutions. So I shared with you our diagram where employers and workers are surveyed by statistical agencies like EDD, and then it gets reported. The way that the data gets shown in labor market reports is through something called an SOC code, or Standard Occupational Classification Code. Every company will name an occupation something slightly different, but a lot of the activities will be similar. And in that case, they will be reported under an SOC code. So to give you an example, let's say that my college names instructors, and another college calls instructors professional development leaders, and another college says that calls them something else differently. They have all different job titles, but essentially instructors have very similar roles and responsibilities across those different colleges and across those different companies. EDD takes those very similar job qualities and job descriptions and assigns them under an SOC code. Oftentimes, employers will select the SOC code or the occupational code directly, and then that data gets collected, and then we are able to determine, or EDD is able to determine, the average number of job openings per year for a given group or occupation. So that's how labor market demand is calculated. We report it, it's reported under a certain code. All of those data sets are aggregated, and then the employers report on how often they plan to hire for a position, how often that position gets turned over, and all of that's calculated for us to figure out what the average annual job opening is. So an SOC code, think of it as a unique identifier for the position. So we're going to go through a report on Thursday with our breakout group for instructional faculty, but I'm going to use the example here so you have a reference of what I'm talking about in terms of an SOC, of what an SOC code is. Excuse me. In all of our reports and a lot of labor market reports, we'll focus on that occupational code or the SOC code. And it'll look something like this. It's a lot of information, I get it, but the top part is the official name of the occupation. So in this case, various companies might call this occupation a property manager, a different company might call it an apartment manager, another company might call it a resident manager. But instead of trying to track every single little job title, EDD aggregates it under this major category or major top SOC code. So all of these positions essentially do what's listed here. They plan, direct, or coordinate the selling, buying, leasing, or governance activities of commercial, industrial, residential, real estate properties, etc. So it's all reported under this SOC code. The way we determine what annual job openings look like is basically, I like to equate it to being seats in a classroom. So let's say that you have a classroom and you have 6 seats. 4 of those seats are filled by students. 2 of those seats are empty. And you want to fill 2 of those seats. That's basically the annual job openings that are available. Employers have 6 positions that they want to fill. 4 of those positions are filled, but 2 of them are open every year due to turnover, such as retirements or some other attrition where an employee might go somewhere else to a different position. So that's how you can differentiate between total employment, or the number of jobs in a region, versus annual job openings. So again, that's the difference between demand and supply. Demand and just total employment. Whenever you see any reports say, these are the number of jobs in a region, they're talking about total employments, about total seats. Whenever you see a report say, here's how many annual job openings are available, they're talking about demand. A lot of times people mix these two up. So I hope this visual is helpful in identifying what is employment versus what is an annual job opening or demand. So we take this information and we put it in our reports. So this is how demand and employment would look like in one of our reports, one of the COE reports. So you can see here, the line graph shows total jobs or total employment in San Diego County for this particular position that I just shared with you, property, real estate, and community association managers. So historically, traditional LMI, between 2009 and 2019, employment or the total jobs, those seats, have increased from 3,900 to 4,800 between 2009 and 2019. Using that historical information, EDD makes projections on what's coming up in the next 5 years. So between 2019 and 2024, the number of jobs should increase or is projected to increase between 4,800 and 5,000. So again, this is historical data. EDD takes data from the past and tries to do projections. And based on what employers reported every year in the past, they've calculated that there are about 418 annual job openings or job openings that need to be filled because of attrition. People retire again or leave for other employment. Okay, so that's demand and how that data is calculated and how it's a little different than employment. Now let's look at labor market supply. So I shared with you earlier the diagram of how institutions report supply data. Here's the recap of it. So again, community colleges report their employment data to the chancellor's office, and it goes up here. And then the non-community college institutions reported to NCES, as National Clearinghouse, and it's through a system called IPEDS, and they use two different codes. If you're in the community college system, we report our data, and I should revise this diagram. It should be going up, and these two are swapped. My apologies. They should be reporting data using something called a top code. So for every single program that is offered in the community college system, it should be assigned a top code. That allows the chancellor's office to figure out exactly how many students enroll in that particular program and how many students are retained and how many students complete the program. For example, those are just some data sets. Similarly, non-community college institutions or non-California community college institutions report to the federal government using something called zip codes. And I'll walk you through what each of those codes mean. But essentially, same idea for every single program in a non-California community college institution, they are assigned a zip code. So let's say that I have a program called Accounting 101. Another college has a program called Intro to Accounting. Another college has a program called Beginner's Accounting. All of those have different job titles. Again, very similar to the demand data. They're all different titles, but they all get lumped up together in terms of their data under the top code for accounting. Same thing with zip codes. Every single non-California community college institution might name their program a little bit differently, but they'll report all their data under a zip code that is most related to that program. So we take all of the data reported from the institutions through top codes and zip codes, and we calculate the number of degrees and certificates awarded by the institutions. That's how we calculate supply. So again, demand is the number of job openings available. Supply is the number of degrees and certificates that feed into those job openings. So they're usually related. Here's how we determine the supply for a particular occupation. So using our real estate example, or excuse me, our property, real estate and community association managers example, we have that SOC code for that occupation. We match it up with top codes or programs from the community college system that have a program related to the occupation or claims to teach for that occupation. And we also look at data from codes from non-California community college programs that also say they train for that particular occupation. So it's kind of like this crosswalk. We call it a SOC top SIP crosswalk. It's a lot of initialisms, but essentially this crosswalk helps us compare demand and supply. So what is a top code? So again, using that same example for property, real estate, and community association managers, we have to identify a top code or a program that trains for that particular occupation. The California Community College system, we have a taxonomy of programs, basically all the list of codes, top codes that an institution can use and assign to a program. in this top manual that you see here on the right. It's a little outdated, but they try to update it very often, but the codes themselves are just a tad bit outdated. So the most recent top code that is related to that occupation that we just looked at is real estate. And so when we look at the description of that top code in that program, if a college offers the real estate program, they'll select this code and they'll report to the chancellor's office using this code. Similarly, if you're not from the California Community College system, you're going to use a zip code. So in a zip code, you can look in the National Center for Educational Statistics and identify what the zip code is. And they have a similar zip code. It's a different number, but it's still real estate. And it has a description here as to what that real estate zip code is. So then non-California community college institutions will take that zip code and report their data to NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics. And then again, we take the data and we look at, in total, for this particular occupation, how many people get awards, degrees, and certificates from California community colleges and non-California community colleges. So that's how the data gets collected, reported, and then how we get our numbers. So how does supply look like in reports? Well, again, we look at these codes. So here's an example. You're going to see this report when we share it out to folks. But essentially for this particular occupation, we identify real estate top code as a related top code. And then we looked at all the colleges in our region that awarded degrees or certificates for that top code, and then we added them up. Similarly, we looked at non-California community colleges and which programs are offered under the real estate zip code, and then we add up their awards or degrees and certificates, and we get a total number of 140 awards related to property, real estate, and community association managers. So demand and supply is really a basic number. We looked at the average annual job openings, which we discussed earlier. Out of about 4,800 positions, there are 418 annual job openings available. That's what you see here. And then supply, again, is the number of degrees and certificates. There were about 140. So you take the two numbers and you subtract it. So for this particular occupation, there is a supply gap in our region each year of about 278 positions. Keep in mind that supply data does not take into consideration people who are already in the labor market who are qualified for these positions. So our supply numbers are relatively conservative, they're low. So the supply gap might actually be a lot smaller, right? There might be more people in the supply than is actually reported in our data. Another way to look at this is to just graph it out. So demand is seen here in this gray box or this gray bar. Again, there are 418 annual job openings. There are about 75 awards, degrees or certificates pumped out every year from non-community college institutions, and 65 awards and certificates pumped out from community colleges, right? And so the bigger the gray bar, the more of a gap there is for this particular occupation. So a lot of our constituents like to take a look at this data and see, is there a supply gap in the labor market for this position? If there is, should we create a program for it? What should we, as a San Diego County, Imperial County region, do about this supply gap for this particular occupation? So that's how some of the data is used. I always recommend that people don't fixate on the numbers themselves, but the trends. As I mentioned, the supply numbers might be a little bit higher than what we show here because there are people already in the labor market looking for these positions, or people who are employed in certain jobs that they might want to transition to this position. So instead of looking at the actual numbers, but just look at the trend. Is there or is there not a supply gap? If there is, what is our next step? What do we want to do as a community college system, as an economic development agency, as workforce development agencies? What do we want to do about that gap? So please use the data to encourage these types of critical conversations as opposed to fixate on the numbers themselves. Fixating on the numbers won't solve anything. Everything that we look at will always have limited information or limited data. I always like to look at real estate as an example. If you're gonna buy a house, you look at all the stats in a house. You'll know what the price is, where it's located, the square footage of the home, etc. It might mark off a whole bunch of statistical data that you are looking for, but until you live in a house, you don't realize that there are plumbing issues or HVAC issues. There's something wrong with the AC. You're always operating on limited information when you make decisions. It's the same thing with LMI. This data is not 100% perfect, but it gives us an idea of the trends. So knowing these trends, how can we discuss and figure out what to do with the supply gap? All right, I'll pause there, but again, I want to make sure I addressed when people say your data is wrong. Again, it's not necessarily wrong, it's limited, and we'll always be operating on limited information. So how do you use this information to make critical decisions and have meaningful discussions? So that's how we'd like for you to look at the data. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, but while we do that, Monica's going to open up the chat, and please type in your questions in the chat box. And we'll come back at around, 3:38 right now. So how about we come back at about 2:45, it's 2:38 right now. We'll come back about 2:45. And then we're gonna do a quick quiz to help you remember all of the data that we just looked at and what those demand and supply look like in the labor market research. So again, take a quick, well, in this case, a little bit more than 5 minutes, but we'll be back here at 2:45. Monica, if you can enable the chat so that folks can type in their questions while we take a quick break. All right, everyone. I know that was a quick stretch of a break. While we're waiting for folks to come back, let's have a little quiz, okay? So I'm going to share with you a link. If you've been to any one of my presentations before, I like to do a quick quiz just to capture some of the information that we discussed. So you can take the quiz in two ways. If you've been to any restaurants recently, they will give you a QR code that you can scan with your phone. Take out your camera on your phone and just put it over the QR code, and it should load a website using that QR code. Or alternatively, you can go to menti.com in your browser, type in menti.com, and the code you see below there, 89472208, you could type in that code and it should load up our Menti for today. So feel free to take up your phone and just put it on your monitor screen. It should read it. Go. Perfect. And we'll get started. There will be a question available to you asking about what we just looked at. So again, for folks that are just coming back from the break, hope you had a good stretch. We're taking a minute to answer some questions. So feel free to go into menti.com and type in that code. We're doing a quick little quiz just to recap some of the information that we shared today. If you don't want to use your browser or your computer, you could take your phone out, and like the QR codes that you see at restaurants nowadays, just scan it with your phone, the camera on your phone, and it should take you to the webpage. And the question that you'll see on your screen is, where does labor market information come from? Let's see if I can share both of those at the same time. All right, so hopefully you'll be able to see the QR code. Here we go. As well as the Menti slide. Awesome. Looks like a lot of folks are participating. Thank you, everybody. It looks like that was able to go through. All right, so I hope most folks are back from their break now. All right, I'm going to do a new screen share. Okay. All right, so everybody here is correct. The data, the LMI comes from, traditional LMI comes from EDD. Again, it aggregates up to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics with other states. And what I didn't talk about yet, and I'm glad some folks caught it, is that a lot of our labor market information also comes directly from employers, either through surveys or focus groups. So whenever there's any data from EDD or from BLS that doesn't really answer the question we're trying to answer, we conduct surveys or we do focus groups. So this is another way for us to collect data directly from our local employers when a lot of the data that public agencies provide are more aggregate in nature. And then we talked about iPads, which is what non-California community colleges also report to iPads, but I just wanted to clarify that non-California community colleges don't actually use top codes or report to Data Mart. So that's why I fixated more on Data Mart for the community college system. Okay. All right, so we talked about this earlier. This is how the data goes up from employers, from the community college system and non-California community college system. All right, so now which one of these is an occupational code? So still with your phone out, you should be able to select one of these options. Is a zip code, top code, or a SOC code an occupational code? Excellent. So I think most of the folks got it. All right. So a zip code, again, is what non-California community college systems use to report their data. Top codes is the program code that California community colleges use to report their data to the state. And then SOC codes are occupational codes. Most labor market reports will refer to a job using the SOC code. And you'll also be able to see data across the whole nation with these SOC codes. Okay, so how do you measure labor market demand or employer demand? All right, remember our analogy of butts and seats in a classroom, the total number of seats versus the number of butts in the seat. So we have here on the left projected jobs. So whether there is an increase in total jobs between 2019 and 2024 for this time frame, or is it the number of annual job openings available? So I mentioned earlier that we look at demand data using SOC codes. So for those of you that selected the SOC code, that is what we use for labor market demand. And then butts and seats versus actual seats, total employment is a number of jobs, but the number of available job openings, 2 available seats that we need to fill, that's demand. So the answer is those annual job openings, not projected employment. Okay, so how do you measure labor market supply? Do you measure it by counting the number of students in training programs? Do you measure it by counting the number of awards that training programs provide? Or do you not count it by the number of people looking for jobs? Excellent. So while we would love to capture the number of people who are looking for jobs in particular occupation, it's very hard to get that data set. But the data set that we do have access to are the number of awards based on those top and zip codes that I mentioned for a training program. So if you remember, we look at the occupational code, the SOC code, and then we match it up with related programs using the top and zip codes. So again, if you're not a community college, California Community College institution, you'll report your data using SIP. If you are a California Community College institution, you'll report it by top. And we also report by SIP to the federal government. But again, I mentioned, I just want to focus on this so you can see the differences. And then using this crosswalk, the data gets reported up, and then we look at the average number of degrees and certificates. So that's how we're able to capture that data. Again, it's limited information because we're not looking at the people who are looking for jobs. So the number of people in the supply side of our labor market research might be actually a little bit higher than we estimate. And again, this is how we add it up. So we take a look at that top code or zip code, and then we add up all of the awards or degrees and certificates from the various institutions that have the program. And then we come up with a total. And then we do a supply gap analysis. So what is it? What is a supply gap analysis? Is it the difference between the number of students enrolled versus the number of students who completed? Is it a comparison of demand and educational supply? Or is it the difference between the annual job openings and the number of awards and certificates? All right, wonderful. So as with every quiz, there's always a trick question. So this one has both two answers. So demand and supply is equivalent to annual job openings and awards and certificates. So if you selected the second option or the third option, you are correct. In actual numbers, we are looking at the number of job openings and the number of awards and certificates, but a supply gap analysis is basically just comparing demand and supply for a particular occupation or a group of occupations. So as I mentioned earlier, demand and supply here, they're pretty much equivalent terminologies, but you can see them represented in data using these annual job openings or those degrees and certificates. And as we saw earlier in the example, we look at the total average annual job openings for an occupation, compare it to the average awards that are awarded, and then subtract, essentially. We do the same thing in a lot of our COE reports for California, so you can see the scale that, it's not just big in San Diego County, the supply gap. We have to fill over 200 positions a year for this job, but even across California, there's a relatively large supply gap that we need to fill. So our reports have the data presented in this way, just to give you context of how big that gap is. If you remember, I said, don't get too fixated on the numbers, but it's just looking at the degree of magnitude of how big it is, right? So again, just knowing that there is a gap, what do we want to do? All right, so thank you everybody for answering those questions. I'm going to get into the Q&A now from our, let me share this per here that you put in the chat. So I'm going to go starting from where I left off. Again, for reliability of the data, it's based on how the data is entered versus how it comes out. So the best way to make sure data is reliable is to educate people. So we try to educate how important these SOC codes are to the employers, and we try to educate educational institutions how important those top codes are and reporting accurately. The next question in the chat was, when new degrees are created, should the major courses have top codes changed to reflect the specific area? I'm wondering if you're asking if new programs should have different top codes from courses. So typically, if you're in the community college system and you report to the chancellor's office, you assign a program that's going to award a certificate or a degree, a top code. Within that program, there are courses that are also assigned top codes. So in aggregate, the data that we look at is at the program level and not necessarily at the course level. The course level data has other uses, which we're not going to get into now, but if you're part of the Strong Workforce Faculty Institute, you'll see that in your own institutions, they can pull data for you at the course level with the top code. So I'm not sure how I can recommend that other than explain how that process works. So if you report program data at that top code, then you'll be able to see data sets compared across other programs with a similar top code. It doesn't necessarily go down to the course data. So I think you'll need to talk to the folks that report using those top codes, or your institutional researchers or your deans, in order to pick the right top code for your course. David asked, what's the living wage for San Diego County? We'll get to that. In our reports, we use a very conservative number. All of our numbers are very conservative, right? But it's relatively low than what you would expect. We put $15.99 for a single adult in San Diego County. And that $15.99 reflects the basic bare minimum to survive in San Diego County. You probably have a roommate, you're probably taking public transportation, you're not going out to eating out. So that's the very bare minimum to survive, no fun, no frills. And that's what we use for a lot of our reports for a single adult. That number changes when you have a different family size. So if you have more children, or you're a single mom, that number increases substantially. But for the purpose of our reports, we use that single adult living wage. All right, so the next question in the chat asks, how accurate are the codes? The job might not be the same, even though it might sound that way. So for example, veterinary technician versus animal care technician. That's very true. Sometimes the codes might not be completely accurate for the position. So I'm not sure the difference between veterinary technician and animal care technician. I'm not an industry expert, but usually what happens is that we'll work with whoever is going to be asking for the labor market information, and we share with them that SOC code or the occupation. And we'll say, well, based on what you're telling me, it sounds like it should be this code in this occupation. And then we'll work back and forth, and you'll tell me, no, it's not a veterinary tech, it's an animal care technician, it's totally different, they do this. So then we would look at something called real-time LMI, or we look at online job postings to very fixate on animal care technician if there's no top code, if there's no occupational code for the occupation you're wanting to get data for. So we work with our requesters on that. And that's how I encourage you to talk to labor market researchers. Instead of saying that code is wrong, you should do this, pick this code, or there's no code for it, talk it through with the researcher and say, okay, I'm looking for an occupation that does A, B, C, D. And then the researcher on our end would look at, okay, based on what you're telling me, the online job postings that post for those skill sets look like this occupation, is that correct? So it's a little bit of a back and forth, especially if the codes may not be exactly the same. Okay, and there are over 800 occupational codes in the system. So if your job is really, really unique, the one that you're trying to find data for, it's an emerging job and it's not in the system, usually our team works with the community colleges to work through that and figure out what other ways we can get data for something that's not collected historically. All right, the next question in the chat. So how do we get at the why there's a gap? Is it pay benefits, lack of interest? People change their mind after obtaining a certificate degree? I would say to Robin that I think it's all of the above. So I love these reports because they're a way to engage with industry. So we'll take a report and we'll say, you know, why is there a gap? And we'll find employers and say, there's a huge gap. Do you feel like you're having a difficult time filling these positions? And employers will go off and say, yes, you know, we have such a hard time, and they'll tell you why. So we really like to use our labor market information as a way to engage with employers. It's a great starting point to kick off the conversation. Now, as an educational system, we're trying more and more to connect with employers and industry. So instead of going in there blind and just starting off a conversation and not having a guided conversation, or have this report and just say, based on what we saw in LMI, it looks like these jobs are in demand. You employ these jobs. Why are you having difficulty filling them? Do you pay a little bit less than other people? If so, how much do you pay? What is the average that somebody else pays? Those types of questions that you can ask the employers. So that way we can get a better idea of why there's a gap. So thank you, Robin, for asking that. All right, so the next question in the chat asks, do companies estimate attrition for positions or look at historical data? So remember, a lot of the data that's reported to EDD, and again, other statistical agencies, is survey data. So if you've gotten a survey recently, it's a point in time and it's pretty subjective, right? So somebody probably sent you a survey about COVID, like how are your experiences in COVID? You'll probably respond based on how you feel in the moment. It's similar to these surveys that are sent out to workers and employers. Though at a point in time, the EDD will ask in the next 12 to 24 months, how many positions do you plan to fill for this particular occupation? And at that time, they might be feeling like the economy is doing great. They're going to fill a ton of positions and they'll respond that way. But then 3 months later, a pandemic hits and the survey was collected 3 months ago. So that data is now a bit outdated, right? So I would say that yes, companies try to estimate for positions that have attrition based on previous trends, based on what they know about their company. But again, it is limited data because it's individuals filling out these surveys based on what they know about their company and what they know about the industry. I love these questions because you're trying to get at the limitations of the data. So as long as you know this, you can engage with the data, again, very meaningfully. So thank you for asking these. Next question, is it recommended to look at previous years along with current reports to identify trends? Yes, I would say so. So I'm not going to share it today because of time, but essentially a lot of times we look at reports, our reports look at previous data and current data. So current data is that real-time LMI that I talked about, which I'm going to share a little bit more with you and how that looks like in our reports. But one of the reports that we released recently was called Resilient Jobs. And it was in response to a whole bunch of people asking us, during the pandemic, what jobs should I prioritize on? Well, remember, the pandemic is really new. We have so limited information, and tons of employers that we interviewed are very reluctant to say what's going to grow and what's going to decline. So our report looked at the past, which was the Great Recession, and analyzed to see which jobs were in demand or resilient during the Great Recession. That's historical data. The recession happened between 2007 and 2009, roughly, in literature, even though the effects went on a little bit beyond 2009. But in our Resilient Jobs report, we looked at that snapshot in time to take a look at historically what jobs stayed resilient, what jobs remained in employment, and what jobs grew. And then we also looked at jobs during the pandemic that employers were posting for, what employers were demanding online. And we compared the two lists, historically and what's currently going on right now. Because if you don't do the two and you only look at the snapshot in time that's going on right now, we might be misleading the reader, right? Because again, people are showing subjectively online what they're posting for. 3 months later, it might change. The data is very volatile. That's why we look at both historical data and real-time LMI in order for us to make decisions, because if it's in demand in both periods, historically and currently, then there's a good chance that it might be in demand in the future. So that's how we look at the different time periods and how we look at LMI over time. So thank you for asking that as well. Okay, and for those that are having difficulty hearing me or seeing the presentation, we are recording it and we'll post it in addition to the slides. On tomorrow and the following day, we'll have links to different resources embedded in the slides. So you should be able to access all of those resources on the slide as well. Teresa, you asked if there's any talk of converting top codes to zip codes. There's always been talk about it. Whether or not it gets done, that's another story. So, and how can the average entry-level wage in LMI data be below the minimum wage? So again, the data is a little bit lagged and it's average. So you think about full-time and part-time workers, when you average that money out, it's over time. How do I explain this very well? So an average annual salary is calculated by multiplying the hourly wage times 2080. So if you're making $16 an hour and you multiply that by 2080, that's your annual salary, right? That's the general rule of thumb. But if you're not working those full 280 hours and you're working part-time and you average that all out, that brings down that wage. So it goes a little bit below the minimum wage. So we are working to update the living wage in our reports. But again, our data is all a little bit lagged, which is why the wage looks lower than what we would expect. And again, we're looking at a conservative entry-level wage because a lot of our stakeholders tend to argue for certain occupations and programs because there are step wages in some of them. So that's why the LMI living wage in our reports is just a little bit low. But I think we're starting July 1st of this year, we're upping it. There's been new data that came out for the living wage. So our reports will reflect that new wage. Okay, and then finally, last question, and then before, we only have 20 minutes left. I want to get everybody out here a little bit earlier. So last question for today, and then Monica, you can close the chat for now. Is there a capability to determine which colleges more effectively use the data to eliminate or develop programs? I'm not going to say who effectively uses the data better or another. It's, again, this is why we're doing this training, is because we want to make sure that you all understand how the data is collected, the limitations in the data, how to ask questions about the data, and how to engage with your colleagues using the data in the reports. Collectively, we will be more effective. So let's just not say one person or another person's better at using the data than others, but how do we teach each other to work with the data? Okay. So thank you again, everybody, for engaging the Q&A. I'm going to go back to our webinar portion of today. So let's see if I can share this. All right, okay. So what else can traditional labor market information tell us? So we talked about demand and supply, how those data sets are reported, how it's limited based on how people select different codes and the data they report during the with the codes. But despite those limitations, we can see some trends, right? So using the example again of property, real estate, and community association managers, that SOC code or the occupation I talked about earlier, we use that code and look at all the employment data available, and we can find out how much the position actually pays. So in San Diego County specifically, employers reported paying these wages for property, real estate, and community association managers. So as I mentioned in our reports, right now we're using a previous living wage. The Chancellor's Office actually uses this for our region as well, I believe, in the launch board. It's $15.99 an hour. Again, that's no frills, it's limited. And if it's a combination between part-time and full-time workers, the wages are a little bit lower. But in any case, the employers report on a range how much they pay for the particular position. So if you're at the 10th percentile, about 10% of the individuals in this position get $14.73. 25th percentile, they get $22.44 an hour, and you can go down the line and see. So we provide this full graph in our reports, so you can see the context of where the entry-level wages of a community college student might land. And again, I know not everybody here is from the community college system, but essentially the thought process is, if you enter this job with no prior training, maybe just got the bare minimum education requirement, you might be making the 10th percentile. But if you get additional training and education, let's say a community college degree or certificate, you should be making around the 25th percentile. So I'll repeat, the 25th percentile is an entry-level wage, but it has inclinations that there are more work experience or education or some kind of training. So people with more education or training or experience should fall in this 25th percentile. If you're going to go to community college to get a certificate or degree, you're putting in that effort. Again, our assumption is that's still what you're making and not making that 10th percentile where you're going in there without any prior training. With some more work experience and education or training, you can get the median wage, and it goes on like that. So that's how you read these graphs that we put in our reports. Again, we put a range for you so you can kind of compare the differences between how often or how long somebody's been in a position or how much experience and education they have. And usually the line goes up, right? The more education and experience you have, the more money you make for that particular occupation. We also provide a baseline, so that living wage, again, we'll update it in July, but this is for a single adult in San Diego County at $15.99. And it's just to show you whether or not this occupation pays at the entry level at or above the living wage. So that's how you can read this graph. Again, what else can LMI teach us, right? So remember, I mentioned that the institutions report data up to the state or the federal government using various codes, either top codes or SIP codes. So the Chancellor's Office provides a database or a system that reports on this data in graphic form. So we take it and we put it in our reports. So some of you may be familiar with something called the launch board. And I know there's a lot of opinions and perspectives about the launch board, but let's just stick with the trends here. So when we look at the launch board, we look at, okay, does this occupation, do programs related to the occupation pay a living wage, or do students who exit from programs that train for this type of occupation earn a living wage? So we know that in the labor market or in the demand side, employers pay a living wage. But what about students that leave our programs? Do they actually get a living wage? So the Chancellor's Office at the state of California, they have a survey that's deployed that asks students this one's linked to their wages. So they have data that accesses students' income records, and it compares students that have graduated or completed a program under this top code and identified whether or not they made a living wage. So for real estate programs, statewide, 60% of students who graduated from real estate programs made a living wage. In San Diego County, San Diego and Imperial counties specifically, we have about a similar percentage of students that made a living wage. When I first did this work, I thought that's kind of low. Don't we want 80 to 90% of all of our students to make a living wage? Remember, sometimes our students are working part-time before they get a full-time position. So the living wage is counting 2,080 hours worth of work. And if our students aren't making that full-time, they wouldn't be getting that high. So instead, our center provides a baseline for you to compare with. So if you look at all career technical education programs across the state of California, 55% of students make a living wage. So if you're looking at all CTE programs in California, career technical education programs, and 55% make a living wage, and this particular program helps students earn a living wage above that average, then I would say that this is a pretty good number, that this program is doing pretty well compared to the overall career technical education programs across the whole state. That's why we provide this graph for folks, so you can have some kind of baseline to compare with and not just immediately get turned off by the 60% number. Because when I looked at this for the first time, I thought, oh, wow, that's so low. Why are not all of our students getting a living wage? Again, there's a variety of reasons, but you want to compare programs to programs and then an overall average of all CTE programs in general. I started to talk about this, but the Chancellor's Office also releases a survey. It's called the Career Technical Education Outcome Survey, and they ask students, did they get a job related to their field of study? So we know about survey data, right? It's a question and a point in time when you respond to it. So this is showing the number of students or the percentage of students who said, yes, I got a job related to my field of study. So if they took a program under that real estate top code and they got a property and real estate and community association management position, and they said yes to this, they would show up here in these percentages. So again, I look at the comparison between the whole state of California CTE programs versus this program itself. So statewide, 61% of students in this top code got a job related to their field of study, or at least they responded in the survey stating that they got a job related to their field of study. San Diego County, it's about 61% as well. And then when you compare to all career ed programs in general, it looks like our numbers are a little bit lower. So not as many of the students in this top code got a job related to their field of study as opposed to career technical education programs in general across the state. So again, that's how you can look at the data. We'll enable the chat if that was a bit confusing, and then you can type in your questions and I'll try to explain it again. Okay, so what else does traditional LMI teach us? So we talked about the supply side. We can also look at educational attainment in the current workforce. So as I mentioned, EDD and other states report to BLS. And in our reports, we provide a graph that looks something like this. It shows here what percentage of people in that position have a less than high school diploma, a high school diploma equivalent, some college, blah, 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 et cetera. So again, just try to think about the trends. So at first, when you look at this, it looks like, you know, the highest percentage of people in this particular occupation is, they have a bachelor's degree. So that might look intimidating to say, maybe the community colleges shouldn't create a program because more people have a bachelor's degrees than others. But if you look at all of these and you add them up, more than half of the people who are employed in this position have an associate degree or less. So we have a term in labor market information called underemployment. And I can't remember the opposite, but essentially it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a bachelor's degree for the position. So a lot of times we'll see a lot of occupations where a lot of people have a bachelor's degree, but if you have an associate degree or less, a lot of these occupations can be filled with a community college education. So that's how we like to look at this. And we note it in our reports. If the majority of the people employed in this position have a bachelor's degree, we'll state it in our report and say that the colleges should note that a majority of folks in this position have a bachelor's degree. And then if not, then we'll highlight that, you know, this might be a good 2-year degree or a short-term certificate based on the educational attainment that in people that are currently employed in those positions. Okay, so we talked a lot about traditional LMI. Real-time LMI is basically the current data that we have access to, and it changes all the time. So real-time LMI is primary and secondary data from online job postings. So we have a system that scrapes job boards all over the internet, whether it's a company's job board, Indeed.com, LinkedIn, Monster.com, et cetera, and it extracts that information in those SOC codes that we talked about, as well as other different job titles, and we can report data based on different key terms. We can also get primary data directly from employers and workers by surveying them. And we like to do focus groups or advisory groups. So if we really need more information and need to put in more effort, we'll contact employers or contact workers that work or people who work in those positions and then ask them to attend a focus group or an advisory group. And then we ask them more questions about the position. So here's how the data looks like in our reports. Again, we extract it from a database that looks at all these different job boards. And then we look at over time, how often people post online for a particular position. So for this example, again, property, real estate, and community association managers, you'll see that the number of people or the number of job postings have increased over time. This is not labor market demand. Again, this is just online job postings data. If I'm frantically trying to hire somebody, I'm going to post a lot, right? So we try to deduplicate the data, but it's more of a trend that we're looking at here. Again, don't pay attention so much to the actual numbers, but more of the trend. If it's increasing this much, then in my mind, I look at this and I'm thinking they're having difficulty filling for this position because they're posting a lot. Why are they having difficulty filling for the position? Again, I would use this data to go talk to people. And the people I would talk to are actually in the report. So we pull again from those different job boards, and these are the top employers that posted for the particular position. So if you are somebody who's never interacted with industry or employers and you're like, who do I even contact? How do I know who's hiring for this position? We give you a list of employers that post for the position. You can Google them, try to contact them on LinkedIn. We have a group in the region called regional directors. Their role is to connect education with industry. So maybe reach out to those resources. But again, at least this gives you an idea of who to reach out to for this particular occupation at minimum. Let's say you're updating your program. The real-time LMI or those job postings data can help us identify what types of skills we should include in that program. So in our reports, we talk about we provide a list of specialized skills, soft skills, and software skills. Again, labor market researchers are not industry experts. We're researchers. So we pull data and we comprise reports for you, or we compile reports for you. So some of these terms we may or may not know, we can look them up for you, but we're not an industry expert. We're not employed in the job. So the way I use this information, again, I ask somebody who's employed in it. Let's say Yardi software, I have no idea what that is. I'll ask somebody who's employed as a property, real estate, and community association manager and ask them, what is Yardi software? Like, is it something that we should be teaching our students now? Is that a recent development or is it an outdated program? Can you tell me? It's showing up in our data. Again, that's how I would use this data to talk to folks. And in our reports, finally, we include top certifications. So aside from just skills, we look at third-party certifications or industry certifications that are most commonly posted for that job. So for this occupation that we looked at, the property manager's occupation, these are the top certs that come up. Similar conversation with employers. Are all of these necessary? Which one is more important than others for you when you hire? All right, so we only have 4 minutes left. So I just wanted to make sure everybody has an idea of what's going on tomorrow and the following day, as well as the reflection sessions. But I just wanted to hammer home this point here before we go into the remaining housekeeping items. LMI, labor market information, should not be the only basis for decision-making. I love data, but as I mentioned with my real estate example and buying a house, all the data doesn't tell you everything you need to know about it. It requires a conversation, requires us to engage with the information and ask why. Why is this happening? And ask more follow-up questions. So hammering it home again, no matter how we slice and dice the data, we have to have a conversation, right? So what's next? So tomorrow, I mentioned earlier, but we're partnering with the San Diego Workforce Partnership to provide this training. So Sarah Burns, their Director of Research Application, will be providing an overview of the LMI resources and tools. So she has more of an external perspective outside of the community college system, which I serve, and she'll share with you other resources and tools that are not related to the COE. And again, she's going to go through some of those pros and cons and potential use cases. So please tune in tomorrow at 2 o'clock. It's the same time, same Zoom link for Sarah's session. And I'll come back on day 3 to talk about scenarios that require LMI and then our reports that the COE uses for those specific scenarios. They're typically in education. And on Thursday, we'll be split into 2 different groups for breakout sessions or reflection sessions. There'll be an email sent out to everybody where you'll get a link to an online form with exercise questions. So these questions are to help you engage with the data and to figure out how to use it in your day-to-day work. If you are counseling faculty or a counselor, you're going to get information to that online form, those exercises, from Christopher Yerkes. If you're instructional faculty, especially those in the Strong Workforce Faculty Institute, you'll get an online form from Robert Chu. Okay, so remember those 2 names. If you're instructional, you get it from Robert Chu. If you're counseling, you get it from Christopher Yerkes. All righty, we got 2 minutes left, but I wanted to thank everybody for coming today, and we'll see you tomorrow. I'll try to address some of the questions if there are any outstanding ones in the chat tomorrow at the beginning, about 5 minutes. I'll ask Sarah for that time if there's anything else you have questions about. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us for the first day.